Okay. Well, I was honored to be the first one here today to kind of kick off the meeting. So, as Nicole mentioned, I'm an ecologist, and I have a very big interest in fisheries specifically, and I do a lot of aquatic insect research as well. So I was really happy to see that we're kicking off the conference today with a fish talk, and then we're also going to be ending the conference today with a fishing demonstration, which I'm really excited to see. So we were able to spend some time at William Mountain Lake as part of this project I'll be talking about today a couple years back. So I'll be talking to you today about the fisheries assessment for Lake Elsinore that we did back in 2019, fall of 2019 specifically. And there were several different objectives that we were looking for as far as this fisheries management program goes. Now, there was a fishery assessment of the lake done back in 2003, and it was essentially a carp removal effort. They knew that there was a lot of carp in the lake. It was becoming a water quality problem because the carp will root around on the bottom of the lake, stir up the sediment, which then releases phosphorus into the water column, and then you get algae blooms. So there was a large carp removal effort back then where they removed, I think it was on the order of like 1.5 million tons of fish or something, very, very large amount of fish from the lake. And it's successful, very successful. They did find there was quite a few there. And so what they wanted to do, when we were talking to let's go back and let's reassess to see where this stands now. So one of the main objectives of the project was to determine not only just the overall ecological health of the lake, but is there a need for any more of this removal of what they call the nuisance fish population, causing water quality issues, specifically the carp. And so that was one of our main tasks in this. And then from that, can we come up with some strategies for looking at future efforts, whether it's stocking or additional removal efforts that would have to happen as a result of this, that we would need to be planning for, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, or something like that. So that was essentially the objective for this program. So I'll walk you through kind of what we did to determine whether the carp can become overpopulated again, as well as just kind of the overall ecological health of the fishery. So when you're looking at the biology of the lake, there's a few different things you want to look at. It's not just the fish. I mean, everyone sees the fish and everyone's interested in fish. People like to go fishing, but people don't go fishing for zooplankton. They don't go fishing for phytoplankton, right? Those aren't like the exciting things. But they have a big part to do with the water quality of the lake, right? It's all part of one big ecological system. So the things that we did, not only the fish, we did that in 3 different ways. And so again, this is back in September, October of 2019. We decided we were going to do a little bit different than was done back in 2003. In 2003, the organization, the consultant that did that work, essentially just used beach seines. So large beach seines where they would go out to the lake, and I'll show you some pictures of our efforts so you kind of understand what that's like. But they essentially used one way to catch the fish that focused mainly on the shallow areas of the lake, the inshore areas. We decided, because we know of the bathymetrics of the lake, there's multiple different types of habitat in Lake Elsinore. You have the shallow areas, share a lot of beach area, but there's also some of the deeper areas that weren't assessed back in 2003. So we wanted to make sure we hit those too. And so we had 3 different ways that we were looking at the fish. One was the beach seine, which is focusing on the shallow, near-shore areas. We also did some purse seines, and I'll show you some pictures of what these are just to get an idea. It's a purse seine type technique where this is the deep areas of the lake, the upper water column of those deep areas of the lake. And then finally, we did something that's called otter trawls, which is, again, the deep areas of the lake, but we're assessing the bottom portion, okay? Not the top, but the bottom portion. So those are 3 different ways that we looked at the fish, 3 different techniques, 3 different habitats that we're trying to hitting. So we can make sure we're getting all the different habitats in Lake Elsinore, not just the shallow areas. And that's going to be important as I get into later in the talk. You'll see why that's important. Of course, as I just mentioned, there's 2 different types of plankton we want to sample. One is the zooplankton, which are the little, crustaceans. They're copepods, if you know what those are, or little water fleas, things that swim around the water column, eat algae. And then, of course, the phytoplankton, which we all know is in Lake Elsinore. So these are the 3 different types of fishery collection techniques that we use. We have in the upper water, well, I guess the laser pointer doesn't work on the screen. Oh well, okay. Not on the TV. So the purse seine, that's the upper water column. So essentially what this is like is you have a boat that goes out, it puts a net out in the water, it drives in a big circle, puts a net around, and then by pulling on the rope, it kind of pulls up the net into a purse, like purse strings, right? And it's just sampling the upper water column of those deeper areas. We also did the otter trawl in the deeper water. There's a good depiction of it there. It's essentially a net with a couple of boards that spread out the net and drags across the bottom, getting all those fish that are in, say, the bottom, 6 to 8 feet of the water column, right on the bottom. And then we've got the purse seine down there in the bottom left. This is a net that's strictly for shallow areas. It's only about, say, 8 feet deep at max, and it gets the full water column within that shallow area. So those are 3 different techniques. And so what we did is we divided up the lake into getting some bathymetry maps. We knew where the different deeper areas were versus the shallow areas. And we divided up the lake into 3 different areas. There was the shallow area, which is depicted by that very light blue, kind of that teal color, which is about 50% of the lake area. There's a moderate area, which is about 8 to 16 feet. And then you got the deep area, which is the darker blue, is the deepest portion of the lake. And that's about 25% of the lake. So we have about 25% in the near shore shallow areas, about 50% of the lake is kind of this mid 8 to 16 feet, and then you have about another 25% of the lake that's greater than 16 feet deep. And so we wanted to hit all these different types of habitat because we figured fish like different habitats, right? You have some that like deep, some that like shallow, some that like structures, some that don't. So you want to be able to hit all these different areas. And so we strategically did our different trawls, so that the lines are where we did the trawls. Those are our trawl tracks. So we were pulling along the otter trawl along the bottom. A couple of different points that are a little bit hard to see. Orange points, the PS3 and PS2 and so forth, those are the purse seine areas where we have the circular net that's sampling just the upper water column. And then along the shoreline, you can see there's some polygons there, some really light polygons. Some of them are blown up into these other images on the top there. Those are our beach seine areas. Those are right around in the shallow areas, the entire water column of the shallow areas. And so you'll notice kind of obvious when you look at the map, but you don't see any sort of sampling kind of on the bottom left or in the upper right. And there's a specific reason for that, because the aeration arms that go out to Lake Elsinore from these different compressors, that's where those areas go out, and we didn't want to drag our nets across and just mess up the lines and pull up all of the aeration lines. So that's why you're not seeing any sampling going on in the bottom of the upper right. That was done on purpose so we don't mess up the aeration system in Lake Elsinore. And so moving on to the fishery observations themselves, showing you some pictures. This is one of our beach seine efforts. So starting in the upper left, you'll see that's what we were loading the beach seine. It's a very large beach seine. It's like 500, 600 feet long. So we use a boat to deploy that. So the boat, we load up the net into the boat. They kind of drive around in a semicircle, starting at the beach, going out a ways and coming back in. That's in the upper right. And then the bottom right, you see, okay, we're starting to pull it in now. This is all done by hand, manual. We had a lot of people out there, probably 15 to 20 people pulling this net because it's very heavy. And then in the bottom left there, you see we come in. This is one of our first efforts. A bunch of fish in the net there. And then you just start pulling the fish out of the net, which for carp, it can be very difficult. They've got some spines that they really like to get hung up in the net, so it's kind of difficult to get them out. But we pull all the fish in, start picking them in the net, sorting them into different buckets for the different types of species, and then you end up with something like this. So in the upper the upper left, we've got a couple of buckets, one of mosquito fish in the left side and one of these silver sides, we'll probably talk about in a minute, on the right. We go through and we weigh them all to get a biomass estimate of what's in the lake for each of the different species. So we're weighing and measuring all the fish that we catch. We caught well over 4,000 fish, so there's a lot of weighing and measuring. And then in the top right there, we go through, we have some volunteers out there with us. The guy I don't remember his name, the guy in that maroon shirt there, he was a volunteer who just lives in the local community. We had, each and every effort that we went out, we would have a public outreach. Okay, let's get some of the community involved here so they can really see, that the city of Lake Elsinore and LESJWA is really trying to promote the lake and trying to improve the water quality and find out what's going on in the lake. So we're really getting them involved. We got them in there taking data for us, measuring fish for us, weighing fish for us, and they really enjoyed it quite a bit. And then of course, here's William Johnson. He was talking about the big one that got away. Right? This is the big carp that got out of the net.
Jonathan Skinner.
What?
That's Jonathan Skinner.
Is that you, Jonathan? Oh, I thought that was William.
It's huge.
Yeah, so we had a lot of fun here. It was a good day. It was really hot. I think I remember one of the days was over 107. 4 days out there. So it was a lot of sweat. Okay, here's a couple of pictures of the purse seine. I don't have great pictures of the purse seine because it's hard to see because it's all underwater, obviously. But in the upper left, we have the boat again, kind of driving in a circle, putting out the purse seine, and then in the upper right, they're starting to pull it in into the boat. And then in the bottom, you see there, that's the otter trough. You can see the couple of boards that was in the earlier depiction that kind of spreads out the mouth of the net, and then it just drags along the bottom of the water. Just to give you some visuals of what these things actually are. All right, so here's some of the fish everyone's interested in seeing what's going on. These are the 10 types of fish that we caught, and all the different types of habitat there. Everything from bluegill, the crappie, catfish, largemouth bass, redfin shad, and then if you read the rest of them there. The one that we have the most common of, you see here on the next slide, is the silver side. These are bait fish. So those silver sides, minnows, were probably about, on the average of anywhere from an inch to maybe 3 inches long. The next most abundant one was the mosquito fish. We found quite a few of those, and then carp following. These are just depictions of all the different types of fish we caught out there. Now the actual numbers. So you can see the total number of fish that we caught along all methods and all depths, 4,791 fish. So quite a few fish. This is across 3 different sampling methods. What you'll also notice is that by far the habitat where we caught the most fish was the shallow beach scene areas. So close to 90% of the fish were caught just in the 0 to 8 foot depth range with the beach scene. And some fish we only caught in some habitats, some fish we only caught in other habitats, and some fish we caught across all 3 types of habitats. Specific, I think the only one we caught across all 3 was the carp. But as you got into those deeper areas, especially the bottom deeper areas, we only caught 2. So out of all of the carp that we caught, only 2 were caught in the very deep areas. And you'll just notice, typically the shallow areas were getting most. So even in the purse seine, the upper water column of the shallow areas, we tended to catch a bit more. And as you get into those deeper areas, we're not catching as much. But by far, you can see the silver-side minnow was over half the fish that we caught. And then the mosquito fish was the next most abundant one, followed by the carp at 311 total fish. So you can kind of see the different types of fish that we caught there and the abundance. And the point that I wanted to make by showing this by depth and by collection technique was that all of them, over 90% of them, were captured in shallow areas. This is important as we move on because I'll wait to explain something about the way the 2003 type survey was performed. It was a bit different than we did this way, estimating the total fish population of the lake. It's important how you characterize and where the fish are captured as far as how you determine total fish estimates, right? Because we're not sampling the entire lake, right? We're just doing here and there, just kind of samplings, random sampling throughout to give us an estimate of what's going on in the lake overall. And how you then extrapolate that to the entire lake, there's different techniques to do that. And it was done differently back in 2003 than we did it here. I believe our estimates are better, and I'll tell you why here in a little bit. So again, this is just a visual depiction of the chart that I just showed you. And this is just number of fish that were captured for each of the different species. But visually, it just gives you a better impression than just looking at a bunch of numbers, right? So you can see the silver-side minnow in that bottom right, and the mosquito fish were over 90% of the population that were captured. Okay, and I think it was actually 91%. And then the common carp next. And then just taking that other species, the little one little slice of the orange up there on the top, and moving over to the other side, that's a depiction of those other 12 species that were captured. Largemouth bass, 4 of those, and so forth. But again, just from a big picture, silver sides, mosquito fish, and carp were the most abundant fish in the lake. But when you look at biomass, that changes quite a bit, right? Because the average size of the carp that we caught was about 2 pounds, maybe on the order of, say, 12 inches or so long. But so when you look at biomass, you can see by far, carp was the most dominant the biomass of the lake. And that's just because even though we only caught 311 of them, they were so much bigger than any other fish that we caught. I think it was like 88% of the biomass in the lake was just from carp alone. Okay, so even though silver sides were much more in abundance than any other species, you can see they're still only the second most as far as biomass goes, and so forth. And so just thinking about, what does this mean? Okay, we see what we caught today. What does that mean looking back in history at other surveys that were done in the past? Well, we're seeing kind of a shift in the percentage of the abundance of the different types of species. And the reason I say maybe on there afterwards is because these collections going back to 2002 were all collected in different methods. And in order to have a really good estimate of what's going on in trends over time, you need to be consistent in the way that you collect the fish, right? Different techniques can give you different answers, and the way that you extrapolate can give you answers as well. So looking back at 2002, they were collected through gillnet. 2003, just beach seines. And then 2008-9, hydroacoustic and electrofishing. 2015, just hydroacoustic, and then of course our 2019 survey used 3 different methods. And so you can see the different abundance of the different species across these different surveys. So going back to 2002, carp was 34%, redfish shad were 23%, and then going into the beach seines of the 2003 survey, common carp went from 33% or 34% in 2002 to just a year later, now they're 88%. Okay, well, I think this is really due just to the way that collections were done, not necessarily an explosion of population over the course of 1 year, but just the way that collections were done and so forth, you get different estimations. Now, I think that the way that we did this study back in 2019, looking at different methods at different depths and using different techniques, gives us a more accurate assessment of what the populations are, because we're targeting specific habitats rather than just a single type of habitat and using that to extrapolate. All right, so moving on from the fish, I know we're kind of getting a high-level overview of what's going on here, but just moving on to the zooplankton now. They're important, right? Even though they're small and you can't really see them, they are important to the lake population because this is a lot of the smaller fish feed on. And these guys, the zooplankton, feed on the phytoplankton, which of course we all know Lake Elsinore has an algae issue, right? And so we want a large zooplankton population to feed on this algae. And so let's talk about that a bit. There's essentially 3 different types of zooplankton in the lake. There's Cladostra, which are you can call water fleas, right? They're large bodied, the largest of these 3 types that we saw. There's rotifers, and there's also copepods. Okay, and within those different 3 classifications, we have these are the different species that we call within them. And so these 3 different species, copepods and rotifers, yes, they do eat algae, but they're definitely not as efficient feeders as the large-bodied cladocerans. The cladocerans, water fleas, are much larger. They're much more efficient at eating algae, and they can even eat larger algae than these other 2 species can. But what's interesting is when you look at the population of the lake overall, and we did this collection over 3 different time periods throughout the year. We did one kind of midsummer when it was the warmest. We did one right before the rainy season started in October, and then we wanted to do one collection during the rainy season, after we got a couple of storms and the salinity of the lake had dropped a bit to see if the population had changed. Because looking at the literature, this is typically what we saw. Looking back at some of the other studies done by UCR or UC Irvine and so forth. And so you can see that the population actually shifts based on season between these 3 different categories. During July, it's about a 50-50 split between the rotifers and the copepods. And you move into right before the rainy season, we have a shift. It's looking like we're getting more rotifers now. It's about 60-40 split. But then you see a huge shift. Once the rains start, the population shifts where now you've got almost 90% of the population is copepods. And you have a little bit of a bump up in the cladostra. These are the water fleas that are very efficient feeders. So the largest population that you see of the cladocerans are during that winter season. And this is because the cladocerans have a conductivity tolerance, so the salinity of the lake, right? And as you get these freshwater influx into the lake, the salinity of the lake drops, which allows these these cladocerans, these water fleas, to reduce much better. They have a tolerance, an upper tolerance limit that Lake Elsinore typically exceeds what the upper tolerance level is for the copepods. So that's why we're not seeing a large population of these guys in the lake. What we would like to do over time is see the salinity of the lake drop to allow these guys to reproduce better, increase their populations, which can then cause them to feed on more algae, and then see an algae reduction. This is called a top-down biomanipulation of the lake. And we'll get into that a little bit more here in a bit. Now looking at the phytoplankton. Overall, this is just the different types of algae that we see in the lake. Overall, you're seeing the blue-green algae, which is the cyanobacteria. That's the dominant. And again, we're seeing kind of a shift across the seasonal cycles from August to October to February. Back and forth between the number of taxa that you'll see. It's really going back and forth between the green algae and the cyanobacteria. And then in the winter, during the rainy season, you see diatoms will pop up. And that's again because you get this freshwater influx and they're more tolerant of freshwater conditions than the more saline conditions in the summertime. But what you see is that overall, even though you have this kind of a lot of different types of taxa, the overall biomass is really dominated year-round by the cyanobacteria, or the blue-green algae. So even no matter what time of year it is, although even during the winter, you do see some bump-ups of the diatom, and they tend to take up about a quarter of the population overall. Typically, it's the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, that just dominate the biomass year-round. So what is the getting back to this carp issue, this is one of the main objectives of the study, is do we need to do another carp removal? Is there enough carp in the lake that it's causing a water quality issue because they're stirring up the sediment to the bottom? And so that was one of the big impetuses for this whole study. So this is looking at the 2003 study that was done by another consultant, and looking at the drop in the density of the carp across their study from 2003 to 2008. This is pounds of carp per acre. So you can see back in 2003 when they started, it was up around 533 pounds of carp per acre. And by the time they had gone through their carp removal program, sending out 1.5 million pounds of carp out of the lake across that 5 years, they ended up at around 62 pounds of carp per acre. So it was very successful, right, in the way that they were able to reduce that through the reduction program. The thing you need to take into account, though, is the way that they did their population estimates. And that was, they were just doing beach staging. So they were just looking at the shallow areas of the lake and using the population that they saw in that area and assuming that you had an even distribution of carp across the lake and just extrapolating that number to across the whole lake. And so that's how they came up with their 62 pounds of carp per acre. Now, when we took our data and did the same thing, just using our beach staging data, we came up with a very similar number, 56 pounds of carp per acre. But we had to take into account that this prior estimate likely overestimated the carp because they were just using the most densely populated area. If you remember back to the table that I showed you, the numbers, over 90% of the fish were caught in that shallow area. Well, that's what they were using. They were using that number to extrapolate that number, assuming that they were equally distributed across all depths, which they aren't, based on our study. Look at the deep area, you have very few fish out in those deeper areas. And so when we were able to basically control for that, we came up with a number of more like 15 pounds of fish per acre, based on our study. So it's more than likely that these higher numbers that you see here, everything from 500, 430, 199, 62, are probably much lower than that overall, because again, there's not many fish out in those deeper areas. And so the number that we got at 15 was actually very good, even lower than what they had gotten back in the 2003 study. So based on this number, we came to the conclusion that overall, we don't need to go through another carp removal effort, at least at this time. The carp reduction that they had done back in the 2003 seems to be still holding, right? There's not much recruitment, there's not much in the way of reproduction going on with the carp at this time. We see the need for another reduction program. So getting back to our original objectives, what are the things that we need to do moving forward to help improve the fishery in Lake LESJWA? So we came up with 5 strategies for this. The first thing is fish stocking. And so one of the fish that has been stocked in the past, and hasn't been done in a while, but is this thing called a hybrid bass, which is actually a hybrid between a striped bass and a white bass. Now these are fish that are highly predatory, and by doing what's called top-down manipulation, by introducing these, they're called wipers for short, white bass and striped bass together, white and stripers. This is a picture of them there in the upper right. Introducing these guys to the lake, what they do is they're highly predatory on small bait fish. And what we know about these small bait fish, specifically the silver size and the mosquito fish, of which those were the 2 top abundant fish that are caught, they like to eat zooplankton, especially larger zooplankton, where you can see better, right? So the things that they're actually preying on are the things that we need to have in the lake to help reduce the phytoplankton populations. So by increasing the population of these wipers in the lake, they will then feed upon the smaller bait fish, which feed upon the phytoplankton, right? So if we can reduce the number of bait fish in the lake and come to some sort of ecological equilibrium between the wipers and the bait fish, specifically the silver sides and the mosquito fish, we can hopefully reduce their populations enough where we start to see these zooplankton populations increase to feed on the algae, if that makes sense. It's kind of, again, getting back to this whole, the whole community is kind of interrelated with each other and connected. So that was our first recommendation, do some stocking of these wipers. The second one would be to discontinue the stocking that has been done in the past of the channel catfish, the largemouth bass, the red-eared sunfish, because based on our studies, we saw that there wasn't really a viable reproducing population in the lake. There were some there, yes, but we didn't really see like a bimodal distribution, 2 different size classes of these fish in the lake, meaning that they're reproducing. We just saw one size class. Okay, so we would recommend that these not be stocked in the lake. On the other hand, we would say we should continue stocking the black crappie and the bluegill, because we did see bimodal, even trimodal distributions of their length classes, meaning that there is viable reproducing populations going on in the lake of these 2 species specifically. Fourth don't stock bait fish. As you saw on our site, we've got a lot of bait fish, and they seem to be reproducing prolifically. So I don't think we need to do any more stocking of bait fish. And then finally, again, conduct periodic ongoing fish surveys every 5 years, every 10 years, whatever we see as reasonable, to make sure that the carp population is staying low and that we have these viable reproducing populations of the crappie, the bluegill, and the bait fish are being maintained. So that was our, basically the 5 different strategies that we'd say for the fisheries program moving forward. And with that, I'll kind of just, I know it was a very quick overview, right? We only had 25 minutes here. I don't know where I'm doing on time, but anyone have any questions on any of that? Oh, yes.
What did you do with the carp that you didn't catch?
So I didn't have time to mention it, but we did have a tagging program. And you might have seen there was one picture in the slide that I did show something like tagging on the fish. So one of the ways that we can better estimate populations is by tagging and recapture. So every carp that we caught, we would tag and release back into the lake, hoping to recapture them at a later date, because we did the beach stains and the other side 3 times. We actually, the populations were so low of the carp, we actually never did recapture one of our tagged fish. So we're hoping maybe some fishermen will catch a carp sometime, and we'll get a call and say, hey, we caught one of your tagged fish. But no, we released, as much as we could, we released fish back into the lake. Some of the smaller silver sides and mosquito fish are so fragile that there's really no releasing them back. But the larger fish, the bass, catfish, carp, we would release them back in.
And my other question is, do you know what the native fish were? Like, since all these are non-native?
It's hard to say. There's not a lot of historical data on that. I do know that the desert pupfish was here at one time. We also know that the lake would periodically dry up on a regular basis prior to the introduction of the recycled water to the lake. I think the last time that it had dried up was back in the 50s. It dried up, I think, for a 3 or 4 year period. And so obviously all the fish would be gone at that point. It would have to be reintroduced. So everything coming in from upstream would be that. So it's hard to say what's native to the lake anymore. Just in general in California, there's not a lot of native fish left. Yes, we'll go here and then back there.
What's the TDS like? Are you seeing that increasing, or what's the overall trend?
Connectivity in the lake right now is around 3,500. So we are seeing an increase. Typically it increases over the summer and decreases in the winter. So if you look at a chart, you'll see it kind of creeping up over the summer and then drop during the winter, and then just kind of does this pattern over time. And so it is at about 3,500, which is above the tolerance of a lot of these larger body cladopsians that I was talking about earlier. Yeah. One question up here.
How does the hybrid bass reproduce?
They don't.
Quickly or?
Yeah, so the hybrid bass, they don't reproduce actually. They're hybridized in such a way because they're done in such a way that they don't want them to be able to be released from their population wherever they're being introduced and then take over other areas by reproducing in such a way. So they're actually, they don't reproduce at all. So they would have to be restocked on a regular basis in order to maintain the population in the lake.
We've actually
Yes,
done 2 stockings.
What's that?
Hi, John. We've actually done 2 stockings of the vipers at 50,000 head per stocking. Actually,
When was the last one done?
last July, and we're gonna. We have to have them certified by Fish and Wildlife. They don't reproduce, and we actually get them from vacuum. So it was a long process for us to get them. So we try to get them every year around June and July.
Introducing species to areas is something you have to be very careful about, because they can come in and take over if they escape from the area that you're stocking them into. They can get other areas, they can take over other areas. So that's why the Department of Fish and Wildlife is very careful about those types of reintroduction species. Yes, sir.
Question regarding the bait fish. I've been also on fish meals for years. For the last 5 years, I've seen a reduction in red shad and an increase in the silver size and mosquitoes. I'm wondering what is creating that change in the bait fish, because it was predominantly a shad base fish.
Yeah, shad, so we did have, like you mentioned, we have had fish kills, periodic fish kills in Lake Elsinore. Most of them have been due to low dissolved oxygen in the lake, although back in 2019, so look at January of 2019, we did have a bloom of golden algae in the lake. And I forget how many tons of fish were removed. A lot of fish died because of that. A lot of the smaller fish died because of that, although we did see some carp die as well. Golden algae produces a toxin that interferes with the yield respiration of fish, so they essentially suffocate. And so there was a big bloom in the lake back in January 2019, and I think a lot of redfish shad died off. And then our survey for this program was that following summer. And so, but back in 2015, there was a survey done by Dr. Anderson at UCR, and he did a hydroacoustic survey. He said that 96% of the population of the lake was bred from shad. Now, I don't know if I actually believe those numbers, because you're just looking at a hydroacoustic survey of blips on a map. And I don't know if you can tell thread from shad from a silverside, just looking at a dot on a hydroacoustic radar. But anyway, it's possible they could have been silversides even back then in the lake.
And maybe Chuck can attest to this, but
Right.
I fished Baby Lake pretty often as well. And I said, all my years, you might see a small pocket of the silverside, but right now, even in Penny Lake, you're starting to see it pop up in one of the schools. And so something is going on there. Downstream of the watershed.
Yeah, they could have come in with imported water as well. I know they're part of the California Water Project. They've taken from the Colorado River, other sources. They could bring in their eggs or actually live fish from these Colorado Water Projects. But then once they get introduced, they just explode when they're in the right habitat.
Would you see a problem with copper-nosed bluegill being stocked in Canyon Lake and coming downstream into Lake Elsinore?
Bluegill, you said?
Yeah, the copper-nosed bluegill. They're the bluegill that grow to 4.5 pounds.
No, not necessarily. I don't think so.
Right.
I
Some research on it.
have to do some research on it. I don't know. I know about bluegill in general. I'm not sure about.
They're in Lake Paris and Diamond Valley and Lake Havasu. So, for reference. The kids.
Fishermen wouldn't have a problem. Any other questions?
So you mentioned fish make the nutrient provided for our food. Do you have an estimate of how much the current fish population is contributing to the nutrients in the water?
Yeah, that's a good question. She was asking what I had mentioned earlier, carp stir up the bottom, and then that sediment gets pushed up in the water column, which reduces or increases nutrients in the water column with algae. And she was asking, do we have any estimate of how much that increases the nutrients? It's hard to say. I don't know if there's probably some studies out there that give us a good estimate of that. I don't know them off the top of my head, per se. So, but it is significant enough that it needs to be dealt with, for sure.
Is it possible to place structures on the ground level of the water to go ahead and try to encourage the growth and reproduction rates of more desirable fish populations?
Yeah, that's one of the things that Lake Elsinore, and I forgot to mention that during the presentation. Lake Elsinore is essentially a flat bowl, right? It's got a very soft bottom. There's not a whole lot of structure. A lot of the fish that we talked about here, specifically they're called centrarchids, which are the largemouth bass and the panfish, like the bluegill and sunfish and so forth, like structure. They like tree stumps and they like rocky reefs and so forth. There's not a lot of that structure. There are a few different areas, specifically on the northeast side and then the southern edge, which are areas that we did not, I should have mentioned this, they're areas that we did not sample because of the sampling techniques that we use. We would just tear up our nets, trying to get into these areas. So it's likely that those populations, specifically the largemouth bass and some of the bluegill and so forth, are underestimated from our survey because we didn't hit those areas where you're most likely to find them with our deer types. But yes, that would help a lot if we could get some structure out in the lake for those types of populations. I know we've probably got to move on to the next presentation, so if you have any questions, I'm sitting right over here at this table. You can come ask me at the lunch break or whatever.